So we're looking at a variety of things in this, and first of all is the idea of harmony, the idea of variety, the idea of abstraction, the idea of structure, balance, proportion, and making everything come together as a single unit but still be able to stand comfortably on its own. So this was all in the context of a tile design where you have four different but related motifs working together to become one motif. So we'll start with this one, and the abstraction is obviously there. Various flowers have been simplified and stylized. Notice that there's all a circular understanding and everything is about the same size in these four quadrants. And then in the middle we have a flower that is basically a little more square than it is round. And of course, radial balance, the tiles are divided by these swirling rhythmic elements. Then we have the vines anchoring the corners, and they're darker in value, and they relate to the values here. The backgrounds are all similar in value. The scale of the circular elements is fairly comfortable compared to the scale of this element. In other words, these don't feel too small, they don't feel too large. There is a lot of complexity with the vine and the leaves on the edges. Don't know that you needed this little bit. These don't really add, they don't really contribute to the overall statement, and so these could probably be resolved in a different manner and a more simple manner, because they're kind of drawing attention away from the main attraction. Each of these four circular elements dominates over the center element simply because there's more value contrast going on. There is an opposing idea which is very thoughtfully contrived. So here we have the violet with the yellow, which is its complement, and here we have yellow with violet, which is the complement. Here we have blue here and orange dominating here. And here we have blue and orange in the background. So this is dominating on the blue and then against an orange background. The common idea, the common element is the vine. That does not change color. Now I'm looking at these little blossoms, these buds right here. And it could be that all you need is to make maybe a third leaf in the center. The reason is that we kind of lose the bud due to lack of value contrast against the green background. There's a lot of movement going on in this and a lot of places for the eye to land. Naturally, the eye is going to gravitate toward the center because that's the center of gravity of the entire design, and that's the intersection of the radial balance. The thing is, though, that the center is not strong enough to hold the eye. So we're going to keep bouncing out around these. Execution is pretty good. It's all done by hand. Looks like it was done in gouache. So there's a lot of things happening. It's very sweet. It has a strong feminine appeal to it. And that is enabled by the curved elements, the round elements. And so they all contrast with the edge, the frame of reference, which is rectilinear. Okay, the pointillist idea here is kind of interesting. Each tile, each quadrant is telling a story, and so we start with the upper right and we're planting a seed, we're watering it. Bottom right, it's sprouted. Bottom left, we have a tree, and then we have a tree in full bud or full leaf. And notice the development of the roots. The pointillist technique here is dominating, and we kind of have to see through the technique to the story that's being told. The elements on the corner and in the center are all about the same size, so this is seen as this quarter round, and this is seen as this quarter round. What is different is the flat yellow color. Everything else is pointillist And so the eye is going to be drawn to the emphatic elements, which are the yellow circles. So the pointillism is dominating, the circles are emphatic, so the eye will land here, then we come out to the corners and we keep bouncing around. And all of this becomes kind of flat pattern that it's a little bit difficult to make out at first. We really have to stop and study what's going on. So the choice of the pointillist technique may not have been the best for this assignment. Now, part of the assignment, perhaps, part of the elements or part of the design can be this, but it's really an all-over thing. And it starts breaking everything apart a little bit. If you look at the structures that are within each frame, we kind of have this idea. And then over here we have all of this. So you can see that the more complex ideas, where there's more breakup between the positive negative idea, are on the left side, and the more simpler ideas are all on the right. So then the question is, does this get balanced by this? And does this get balanced by this? Everything also is straight up in terms of there's a vertical orientation to each of the tiles. They're all going the same direction, and that's not a problem. But in terms of composing things, this tile doesn't have much relationship to the other three in terms of design and positioning. Is there a way that the story could have been told with a lot greater sense of unity and consistency between the four tiles? Right now, the consistency is in the pointillism, not in the structure or the composition of each of the tiles. Proportionally also, the sunbursts are a little bit too small, especially the one in the center. It's having a hard time holding its own proportionally against the more complicated surfaces, against the more complicated areas. Interesting idea, though. It would be interesting to see if in each panel, part of the panel, we're using the pointillist pattern. And then you also had a lot more solid color shapes going on. Because right now everything's the same and there's nothing really that breaks the monotony of the sameness except for the yellow circles. Here we have kind of the opposite idea of what we just saw. There is a fairly plain surface with subtle texture. There are four elements that are about the same size as the center element. So there is no kind of give and take between the four elements and the center device. They're all competing because they're all the same scale. They're all contributing to, again, a monotony. There's nothing different in terms of scale. And you've got an abundance of negative space that could have been made use of. You know, perhaps if each of these cuts of wood, these cookies, were larger, and then this remains the same size or even goes a little smaller, we would have that proportional contrast, which would create a lot more interest. So you can see that the background colors are all very similar in value, so they all blend together. The darkest values are these little areas here and also out here on the corners. So those are going to pop the eye or pull the eye because they contrast to the greatest degree against the background. It is basically a kind of a frame and frame, so the centers echo the perimeter, the frame of reference of the design. And of course we have each of the squares. So that's basically your structure, and then this is also a square. So it's highly stable. There's not a lot of diagonal movement in this. There's not a sense of things doing this. It's all frame in frame idea. Okay, the center motif is definitely too large. It actually requires the chickens to be smaller because this is so dominant. The abstraction of the, looks like a feather, is really kind of nice. The background, the background treatment behind the birds is very interesting. Birds themselves are fairly complex, and the use of transparency, the overlay, the density definitely lends more complexity to things. This bird is kind of doing this. This one's kind of doing the same thing. This is doing this, and this is kind of straight up and down. So this is the odd man out or odd bird out. What's happening there is that the eye is basically going to be focusing on this guy because he's that much different from everything else. This one is somewhat different from these two because it's mainly a directional change. But this one is very static, whereas there's more movement. These guys are all in profile, this guy's in silhouette. We're using basically a blue-orange complement relationship in the background, and there's sufficient value difference to separate the birds forward from the background, but the birds do compete with the feathers. And this one looks like he is having a moment with the feather and is about to pounce. And this one looks like he is perhaps watching this guy have a moment with the feather. We kind of lose the legs. They're just a little too thin compared to everything else. Probably should have been at least as thick as this line. Interesting idea, kind of fun. You got these little characters going. Needs a little bit of refinement. Maybe if this one, we were kind of looking at him kind of from the back side, and he had his little, tail up, and then his little bandy legs coming out. So there would be a diagonal relationship there, and then these guys would easily just relate to each other like that, because it's almost like they're having a moment with each other now. The other thing too, there's a lot of empty space up here, and that's basically pushing the bird down. Everything else is more stable. There's enough space underneath and around to stabilize everything, but up here this is all too much, and so he's kind of getting compressed. Okay, this is another digital solution. Having the white on this, and then that white is cut through, this is a little bit distracting. There is absolutely no reason that needs to be divided like that. And the white really doesn't belong. Better to maybe have pulled a gray or another color that was closer in value to some of the lighter colors within the 4 quadrants. There is a lot of complexity in the different ways that the plants were drawn. But this is so different that it stands out and separates and does not unify. Also, the points are not quite lining up. This point especially is having a hard time finding where it's supposed to go. This is also having a hard time finding where it's supposed to go. And then this should not be doing what it's doing. What is that? So the thing about doing things digitally is that you have the opportunity with the software to make things very precise. When you don't do that, it just looks sloppy, and that's kind of what's going on here. We also have more room here than we do down here. This flower is not centered, or else the circle's not centered. So again, remember, the good design is found in the details. And if you get lazy or sloppy with the details, that becomes a problem. Your work is not excellent. So unfortunately, this has a lot of potential, but in a lot of ways, it's not measuring up. Don't know either that you need the white frames, because they're not really serving any purpose. They don't add anything to the design, and the design would probably be just fine and much improved without those white frames. Good choice to make the all-over pattern on the diagonal, and then these larger abstractions on the opposing diagonal. This whole device is not large enough, nor is it small enough. It's kind of hanging out there in the middle, trying to decide, well, am I going to compete with these guys in the corner, or am I not? What am I going to do? Actually, if the corner motif itself were just maybe this big, and allowing these to become the hero, and these guys could also be smaller. This pattern, by the way, is not working. Look how much space is in here versus this amount of space in here. So this pattern works okay, but this is not structured properly. This is lazy in the foundational aspect of that frame, because again, too much space here and too little space here. So, what's going on? Why? When we get to the end of the course and we are doing a final project that is meant to bring everything together, you've really got to bring everything together, and to use that phrase, bring your A game. Mind the details. Always mind the details. It is important. They do get noticed. And if your details are sloppy, the value of your work, the client's perceived value of your capability of solving their problem is going to be greatly diminished, and you don't want that. There's a lot of motion and activity going on with this. We have an alternating pattern going around in the borders, and a central motif with a spiral in it. Don't think the spiral is necessary. It just doesn't add anything to the design, doesn't contribute anything specific. The way the flowers are abstracted with the more hand-drawn scents, really nice contrast of texture. The flowers themselves are all about the same size. This one could actually come down more and fill that space a little more, because all the other three are basically seated very comfortably in the same way. So there's a unity going on here that we don't have here. We're not seeing this straight on like we're seeing these. This we're seeing kind of from a 3/4 view, and that would tell us why these petals are doing what they're doing and there's this much space, but they need to come down in some way. Utilize the space in the same way so that it doesn't have an awkward moment there. The color scheme here is very warm. It's lively. There's a lot of contrast of color. There's contrast of value mostly in the outlines. And remember, outlines will flatten everything. The eye does kind of carry around the border because of the energy, the activity, and the contrast in the border kind of overlooks the flowers in the 4 quadrants. And then the center motif does work with the border. It's probably, it has a very different character, a very different tone of voice than the other flowers. That alternating, radiating pattern is not unifying with the flowers. And it's kind of struggling to unify with the borders. So the proportion, the size is good related to the larger flowers. Not a lot of value contrast. Colors are nice, but it's not really doing anything. The center motif is interesting. It has overall a very postmodern vibe, but if we go into grayscale, really you basically have white and probably up to maybe a 10% gray. So there's no contrast with this. It's actually hard to look at because there's no value contrast. And it's very difficult to see the leaves and whatever that is, that little cluster and the blue there against the red, or maybe that's orange. Your abstractions go very linear, which is fine, but it would be nice to see some more substance to this. And is there a reason why, if these are carried out all the way across here, that they weren't also carried around up there? What is the reason these are kind of breaking off? Also, there seems to be a different idea going on here and here than there is here and here. The bottom half is actually carrying a little more weight and a little more visual interest because of those very fine lines that are going out on the diagonal. Also, we have this way out here, and we have this here, but it's not aligned with this. And we have this here, and that, of course, is not aligned with that. And there's nothing over here, this tiny little white dot. So structurally, compositionally, color, value, things do unify, but there are a lot of question marks as to why there's very little presence of the white elements here or over here. So it's kind of like a scatter graph. It needs to be more interesting and captivating visually. I mean, you've done really well with the abstractions of the foliage. Why not play that up by highlighting them with darker value to bring them forward from the ground? Abstractions here have gone quite geometric. This is dominating on the diagonal intersection. It's the first thing we really pick up, and these are uniformly moving out and away from the center. I've kept things fairly simple. The green and the red-violet are alternating, and then the center motif is alternating those colors in the background. Each of the quadrants is using looks like a violet, dark blue, the lighter blue, and the green with the brown. Those are all reflected here. And then the corner elements colors are reflected here. So there is a overall unity. Overall, it works pretty well. Are these meant to actually be circles? Because they're kind of reading more as ovals on the crop. And again, that's a detail thing. These could be maybe half the size of what they are. They're a little too dominating in terms of their calling attention to themselves, taking attention away from the butterflies. And it's kind of like you've got really pretty butterflies and the distracting little gnats flying around. So they could be a lot smaller than they are. The question to ask is it necessary for the design to do what it needs to do? And if not, then don't do it. This has a fair amount of value contrast. It doesn't have white, it doesn't have black, so it's not a full range of value contrast. It is interesting. The warm colors in the corners pull the eye outward from the center. So we want to land in the corners. So it's obvious that attention was paid to how the color is distributed, attention was paid to scale and to proportion and to where things are positioned in the design space. There's a strong uniformity and a regularity which helps pull the design together and make it orderly and unified.